Any carryover questions or anything that's occurred to you during your intense study during the last 2 weeks about Gettysburg? Anything you want to bring up before we get going? Yes?
So we did a bunch of reading, and I don't know what a flank attack is, but maybe a military guy can explain that. I was about to ask them.
What do you think a flank attack is?
Coming around the side.
Very good. That's a flank attack. You've got it down. If I attack you like this, what is it?
Direct up.
Frontal assault. Yes. If I come, oh, I can't go in front of that. I had instructions not to go there. If I flank Carolyn or Caroline? If I get on this side of Caroline and attack like this, that's a flank attack. And that's really much better than a frontal assault. And if I can get all the way over here and attack like this, absolutely golden. So those are and everybody on both sides knew that frontal assaults are not a good deal. And every single Army commander during the war launched frontal assaults at some point, because just knowing what you want to do doesn't mean you can do it on a battlefield. But your intuition was perfect on flank attacks. You had it right down.
Pause it a second.
Oops, something's not working. I got in the way of that, didn't I? Oh, it's not turned on. That wasn't my fault. Is it working now?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay. Alex.
I was just wondering how effective artillery really was at this time.
How effective was artillery really at this time? It was not very effective compared to artillery. Now, depending on what it was trying to do, when you get on the field with the Marines and talk about the pre-Pickett Pettigrew assault bombardment, you'll get a very good example of what Civil War artillery couldn't do very well. And what it couldn't do very well was hit a shallow target from any kind of distance at all. There it's firing at between 7/10 of a mile and a mile and trying to hit a target that's about 100 yards deep. And it had a very hard time hitting a target that was 100 yards deep. If, on the other hand, if you're all lined up and assaulting me, and I have a battery of artillery here, and I'm firing canister at you, I'm very effective, really effective, and it's very bad news for all of you. So it depends on what the situation is on the battlefield in terms of how effective artillery is. But in terms of percentage of wounds, artillery probably accounted for between 10 and 12% of the wounds during the Civil War. Overwhelmingly, we've already talked about this, overwhelmingly the wounds are inflicted by shoulder weapons carried by infantrymen. I'll bring a musket in next time, and you can all, or not all of you, you won't all do it, but some of you will fire a percussion cap in here, and you'll see how heavy a musket is, how long it is, what's it like with a bayonet on it, and so forth. But that's what did the damage during the Civil War. It's infantrymen with muskets. Yes, Michael.
So along Alex's questions of like weapon effectiveness, you mentioned muskets. I'm just curious as to, now that you're somewhere in between like a pure bore musket and like an actual rifle, what is the
You're not in between. We're all carrying rifle muskets, virtually all of us.
So what is the range you could actually?
The range expands from about 100 yards for a smooth bore shoulder weapon, which would have been the main weapon during the American Revolution, even during the war with Mexico. Extend that to 250 to 300 yards. I think 250, you see different numbers for how far a rifle musket would be effective. 250 yards is a long ways. If you have somebody 250 yards away from you, but if what you're doing is laying down a volume of fire at 250 yards, it can certainly be effective enough to prevent cavalry from attacking you, to create problems for artillery horses and so forth. But you get at least double the range, probably 2.5 times the range of a smoothbore weapon. And that's enormously important on a battlefield. It makes a huge difference, There are a handful of units at Gettysburg that don't have rifle muskets, but only a handful. Virtually all of the soldiers are armed with exactly what I will bring into class next time, which is a .58 caliber, muzzle loading, single shot, of course, rifle musket. And the way the correct term in mid-19th century parlance is rifle-musket, not rifled musket. It's rifle-musket.
How long
Brian.
does it take them to reload to shoot?
It's another thing. You often read that a veteran infantryman can fire 3 times a minute. I doubt there were very many times in the war when infantrymen, for any sustained period, fired 3 times a minute. I think twice a minute would be more realistic. You could do it 3 times a minute, but to load 3 times, aim 3 times, and fire 3 times, I don't think that would happen very often. You could do it. There's a great scene in Glory. How many of you have seen Glory, the film Glory? Great scene in Glory where the one infantryman is a great shot, and he hits things, and then Colonel Shaw wanders over and tells him to and says, "Do it faster, do it faster." Holds his pistol right up by his ear and fires it, and the guy gets a little bit rattled. It's hard to maintain a really efficient 3 times a minute rate of fire, I think, for an infantryman during the Civil War. It's many processes. You have to bite the cartridge, put the powder in, ram it down, ram the round in, put the cap on, get the cap out of your cap box, put the cap on. There are all kinds of things that can just take a little bit more time in a stressful situation. So I think 2 is safer than 3. Allison?
So then do they structure the line that one person shoots first and the other person?
No, you might fire a volley to begin with, but once the fighting really started, it would usually be firing at will once it got going. And there are, I don't know how many of us there are in here. Are there about 30 of us? 30? We're roughly a company of Civil War infantry. By the time of Gettysburg, the regiments were about a shade more than 300 men each. So multiply us by 10 and put us on about 150 yards wide piece of ground, and you have an infantry regiment on the battlefield at Gettysburg. We'd cover about 150 yards, maybe only 100, but that would be it, and there'd be 300 of us. So sometimes you'd have some men reloading in the back and others firing in the front, but it's pretty much fire at will once things really got going. You'd start with a volley, and then you'd go to firing at will. Jeff?
So in a charge, are you loading, running?
Nope, you're not loading or running. I'm sure they're going to walk picket Pettigrew with you, and what you're going to do is walk it. Took about 17 minutes to get across that ground, and you walk, and you don't stop and fire, because if you stop and fire, you're not attacking anymore. You're stopping and firing. So they don't stop and fire until when you get there, you'll get all the way to the Emmitsburg Road as Confederate infantry before you would have stopped and returned fire. You've been taking fire for hundreds of yards. You don't stop and return it until you get there, because if you do that, now you're just a battle line. You're not an assaulting formation anymore. It takes incredible discipline to do that. And to just keep walking closer together than all of you are. These linear formations that they used and drilled endlessly to perfect are absolutely predicated on their being able to stand almost shoulder to shoulder and do the maneuvering that way. And if you 3, Alex and Jeff and Kristen, are coming toward me and Jeff gets hit, Kristen and Alex just move together. And so the lines tend to become more compact if they're maintaining the kind of integrity that they should as you move through an assault. And you'll see that really happens at Gettysburg. The Confederate line starts out about 1.1 miles wide and ends up on about a 300-yard front at the end. Yes?
So what's the benefit of standing shoulder to shoulder? It seems like the opposing side could just fire.
They can. The advantage is you can control people that way, and you can't control them otherwise. The whole point is, how do you control? We'll talk about a regiment again. I'm the regimental colonel. I've got 350 guys. It's incredibly loud. It's very smoky. How do all of you know where you're supposed to be? You know where you're supposed to be because we've been drilling and you know you're supposed to be in between the 2 guys on your right and left. That's where you're supposed to be. And your flag is in the middle of the regiment. That's why flags are so important in the Civil War. If we are part of a regiment, we get a good sense of where we're supposed to be by seeing where our flag is. Flags aren't just, they're not just kind of there to dress up a line. They serve a real function on a Civil War battlefield. And that's why so many flag bearers are shot down on battlefields. It's essentially, not quite, but essentially a guarantee to get wounded if you're carrying the flag at the beginning of a major assault. I'm sure the Marines will talk about regiments. 24th Michigan on the first day at Gettysburg had 8 flag bearers shot in the course of a fight for about an hour. And the flag bearer, of course, doesn't get to shoot at anybody. Flag bearer's carrying the flag. But the flag serves a real purpose because it helps you know where you're supposed to be. And if you don't maintain that kind of integrity, then again, you lose all efficiency on a battlefield. So it doesn't make sense to us. We wouldn't do it now, but that's how they operated on these battlefields.
So we talked about last time about how, for the South, the officer corps just basically eradicated battle after battle. I mean,
Eradicated is a little strong.
well, I mean, that's just like significant losses. To what
Yes.
degree were officers like targeted?
Well, they're absolutely targeted. If you're an officer on a nice big horse,
Okay.
and here we are, your side of the room is attacking our side of the room, and you're the only guy on a horse, I guarantee you're going to be the first guy shot. Because we all know why you're on a horse. Who gets to be on horses? You said it under your breath. Officers. Yes, officers get to be on horses. And not just captains don't get to be on horses. Who really gets to be on a horse? You're going to get a nice, juicy, field-grade officer if you see somebody on a horse. That's who's on a horse, for the most part. So yes, shoot them first. Shoot them first. Alex?
Just going back to you're talking about the tactics of the way that battles were waged and how regiments fought. And I mean, that seems that all these generals were educated in the 1830s and 40s and then probably looked
Well, some in the 50s.
maybe. And
There are a lot of young guys. The Army's full of young guys who have a lot of rank.
but it seems
20-year-olds
like they
who
have
are division commanders.
their notion of how to fight is based largely on Napoleonic era.
Yeah.
To an extent.
Yeah.
But how did the tactics and the methods evolve during the course of the war?
They didn't evolve that much during the course of the war because there's no real alternative to controlling. I mean, they evolved some, but right down to the end of the war, you get assaults where they line up, just like I've described. John Bell Hood and the Army of Tennessee at the Battle of Franklin, 18,000 of them lined up on a late November afternoon, just the way I've described, and attacked across 2 miles. So there are more of them in Pickett's charge. They're charging twice as far as during Pickett's charge. They have no artillery support, and that's what they do. There's not a real alternative to this. They're not remaking tactics and training in the course of this war. They adapt, and field entrenchments become much more important. But they still attack field entrenchments the way we're talking about, which of course increases by a significant factor the power of one defender against one attacker. So it doesn't really change that much. It changes some, but overall, somebody looking at a battlefield on the Civil War from a helicopter and looking at one from the war with Mexico, or looking at one from the War of 1812, or looking at one from the American Revolution would see much more in common than they would different. The big difference in tactics, and we talked about this last time, comes back to the rifle musket. It moves artillery and cavalry out of the center of most of the battlefields. The cavalry, absolutely. The artillery has to move back because the horses are so vulnerable to infantrymen with rifle muskets. And that's a big difference. Napoleon could run artillery up very close and could overrun infantry with cavalry sometimes. That doesn't happen in the Civil War. Anybody else? Yes?
I can't remember if we covered this last time, so.
Doesn't matter whether we did or not, we can cover it again.
There's obviously casualties building up on the field, so are they removed between the battles? And if so, is there like a ceasefire that everyone can kind of?
There's not a ceasefire. Well, there are sort of impromptu ceasefires, but no, there's not a ceasefire, and they're removed as they can be removed and taken to all kinds of medical stations, barns, buildings, just back in the woods someplace. Yes, they are. And so you don't have a battlefield littered with wounded men in the court. I mean, the second day at Gettysburg, most of the wounded from the first day at Gettysburg would have been taken somewhere. Now, there'd be lots of dead guys on the battlefield, and the bodies would, from all 3 days, would build up, and then it falls to the army that wins the battle to take care of most of them. Although, if you three are really good friends and Graham gets killed on July 1st, you might, just the two of you, take it upon yourselves to bury him very quickly at the end of the first day, just because you're close and you're comrades, and that's what you do. But for the most part, it's the Army that controls the field that takes care of all of that. Jeff's smiling. Maybe they wouldn't take care of Graham. Maybe they'd say, finally, Graham's not in our mess anymore, and we can get somebody in who isn't so obnoxious in a tent in the winter. Anyone else? All right. I want to generally, we're supposed to talk about Lee and Meade and their decisions, their leadership. That's what we're going to do tonight, and you're going to carry most of the weight here. And so we'll start with Lee. There are three of his big decisions I would like to talk about, but we can go wherever you want to go. Whatever. I want to talk about his decision to invade the United States as opposed to remaining on the defensive, his decision to concentrate when he was spread out across southern Pennsylvania toward the end of June, and then his decision to attack, and to attack on the 1st, on the 2nd, on the 3rd. That's a three-part consideration there. With Meade, I think his key decisions were, first of all, whether to stay and fight at Gettysburg. Is this the place where I want to make the fight after the big Union disaster on July the 1st? Then how do you respond to the problem that Dan Sickles confronted him with on July 2nd? On the 3rd, or the night of the 2nd, he calls a council of war. We'll talk about the difference in leadership style here. Lee does not call a bunch of councils of war to decide what to do. George Gordon Meade, there are very different leadership styles in place on the part of Meade and the part of Lee. July 3rd, Meade's decision not to follow up in the immediate after, in other words, not to counterattack in the aftermath of the Pickett-Pettigrew assault. And then finally, his decision to pursue with less than a sense of urgency, I guess would be the kind way to put it, over the several days following the battle. Each of those is an important decision on Meade's part and an important decision on Lee's part. So let's start with Lee, and somebody start with just impressions of Lee and his leadership in this. You've read essays on Lee specifically. If you read Porter Alexander, he has a lot about Lee's decisions in there, and of course your little booklet that Harry Fons wrote also addresses it. But what are some of your impressions about Lee and his leadership in this campaign? And I don't believe no one has any impressions of that. So, yes.
So we talked about this a little bit in the first couple sessions, but obviously very aggressive and, one of the only commanders, from the South that had won any battles. So I think his leadership style was very much focused on, taking the initiative and, constantly pressing the North. And he actually, I found it interesting in the reading that he had a different perspective on how he thought, the Confederacy was going to win was by militarily defeating the North on the battlefield, where there are some opinions where it should be more defensive. Just
what does that mean? What does it mean, defeat them on the? Did he think they could defeat the United States absolutely on the battlefield?
No, but basically to a point in which the population of the North no longer.
That's the key.
And I think there were some opinions that said that we don't necessarily need to defeat them every time on the battlefield, but as long as we take a defensive position, then the North will.
Yep, that's the other side.
Become tired of the North. So I think that maybe it was his decision to invade was really predicated on the fact that he had won these battles and he did have some confidence going into it. In that. What's the battle before
Gettysburg? Chancellorsville. And what kind of battle is that?
It's like
a big Confederate victory, but a victory. Does it do tremendous damage to the Army of the Potomac? No, not really. Much lower percentage of casualties. So what are Lee's options after you're Lee? You've just won the Battle of Chancellorsville, and you've suffered 13,000 casualties out of your 63,000 men. And you've inflicted about 17,000 out of the 130,000 on the Union side. What are your options? You're sitting there along the Rappahannock River. The Union Army's just gone to the other side of the Rappahannock River. What are your options? Kenny?
Let them come and attack you.
In other words, just hunker down.
Yeah.
Okay, that's one option.
And then I think the other one that Longstreet was suggesting was sort of go around them and try to get in between them. And
Well, you're in Pennsylvania already there. I'm talking about right after the Battle of Chancellorsville. You've won this victory, and the first option you gave is one of them. Hunker down and just be on the defensive. So there's option number one.
So it's not a very good option, but you could try to attack across the river.
Attack right there.
Right.
Just take the tactical offensive there along the Rappahannock River. Okay, that's a second option.
Try to maneuver and attack them from a different point.
Right, but still on the same ground, you mean? Okay, yes. So that, in other words, you two are both saying stay in place but attack. Hunker down and let the Federals come at you again.
Wasn't there other option to go to Washington?
Yeah, that's never an option, but you're going in the right direction anyway. Lee never thought about capturing Washington. That is not an option, but going north is the third option.
Right,
So
so
take the war into the United States. Okay, so those are really the three alternatives that he has.
Why was taking Washington not an option?
Because Washington was defended by an incredible question is why isn't Washington an objective? Because it's defended by this point in the war by an incredible series of forts, hundreds of pieces of artillery, a huge garrison, and an army much larger than yours that will be defending it. So that's just really not an option. Not an option for Lee.
I think in one of the readings it said Longstreet said to go west and support the other
That's the
army.
fourth option. So just explain what that is, Brian.
One
We have all night.
Yeah, I'll find it in here again.
No.
But wasn't it to try to gain some decisive victories on the other front, not focus
In
on-
order to do that, what happens to Lee's army?
It gets a lot smaller.
It gets smaller. So sit and wait for the Federals to come at you again. In other words, stay on the defensive. And they won a big defensive battle at Fredericksburg back in December of 1862. Attack the Army of the Potomac where it is. Go north toward Washington. Menace Washington without thinking you're going to capture it. Or yours is really a variation of stay where you are. Take troops from Lee's army and send them either to the army that's defending Vicksburg, which was commanded by a man named Pemberton, or send them to the army in Tennessee, commanded by Braxton Bragg. How much support was there for that?
I don't think much. I don't know. I don't remember.
Huge amount. Almost everybody wanted to do that except one person, who was Lee. Jefferson Davis sort of inclined toward that. Gustave Touton Beauregard was in favor of that. Joseph Johnston was in favor of that. James Longstreet was in favor of that, together with an array of politicians who were in favor of it. What are some reactions to that? Brandon, you're smiling.
It just reminds me of sometimes when we talk about businesses or we look at businesses, within a corporate setting, people don't want their fiefdoms to be split up.
Of course they don't. Or in an academic setting, every dean wants all the stuff they can have. Every little deanlet wants their little shop to have all that they need. More assistance. More. So
you want to maintain the largest number of people, the biggest army you can. I would also like to think, given some of the reasons that he decided to fight for the South, and particularly for Virginia, that sending troops out west may have left Virginia less defended.
So this is just Lee the Virginian sort of showing himself to really be a homeboy here. He just wants to protect Virginia.
I think part of that.
Okay. Somebody else weigh in on this.
Well, I have to agree with Lee here. I mean, why send more resources to an area where you're losing and take away resources from an area where you're winning? I mean,
Seems plausible, doesn't it, to argue that?
Yeah. So I mean,
Does Braxton Bragg have a string of victories to his credit out west? What's his record? What's his one-loss record look like? Well, his one column has a 0 in it. That's all you need to know. And so that is a compelling argument that Lee doesn't make directly, because he can't really say that, can he, Mr. President? That's a ridiculous idea. You've got losers in command of your armies out west, and you're going to take men from me, who has won a series of victories? Are you an idiot? He can't say that. He says it in a nice way.
Was it an option for him to bring Bragg's men to him?
No.
Why?
Because you have to protect Tennessee and the approach to Chattanooga, which was a city that was very important because key rail connections went through Chattanooga that linked the Northeastern Confederacy, that is Virginia, to the interior of the nation. So you need to protect that. And there was a belief that you needed to protect Vicksburg. So you've got three major Confederate armies in the spring of 1863. And the question is, how do we apportion the strength among those three? There's a strong element that says, don't invade the North. Lee can hold on here, take troops from him, and maybe that will allow someone in the West to win. Allow someone in the West to win.
Yeah, but don't you also have, I mean, part of Lee's objective as a whole was to defend Richmond as well. So, I mean, I guess half the philosophy is all you need to do is sit behind your Confederate lines and wait for eventually the Federalists to give up. Versus Lee, who was saying, I'm an army of 60,000 people trying to protect the capital of the Confederacy from 130,000 men to the north. Why would you divert resources from me for that, right?
He would say that. He's going to be an army of 75,000 as he goes north, because James Longstreet, who had been gone during Chancellorsville, comes back. But yes, he would say that. He did say that.
You also say that the eastern armies were the ones most followed by the public.
They were.
And so by keeping more people there and attacking and winning victories there, then you could kind of more demoralize the north.
If you're running a business that has 5 divisions, and one division just makes piles of money year after year, it is your golden division that you just, every year, it produces. You have 2 that do okay, and one that loses money every year, and one that really loses money every year. Well, is your first move to take resources from your one division that's really giving you good returns to sort of prop up? Maybe it is. I don't know what the answer to that is in the business world. Is that how you do it? Let's weaken our best division so that maybe Kyle's division, which is really lousy year after year, Kyle is right on the edge. He has one more bad year, he's history. But let's give him a bunch more resources and take them away from Marcus, whose division makes money every single year. He is the man. But we're going to help Kyle by weakening Marcus. Does that make sense?
Well,
Does to Kyle. Kyle says, give me the resources.
I mean, the problem is the whole company would go bankrupt if Kyle's division goes under. I mean, theoretically, the South could have won every single battle in Northern Virginia. However, if the Mississippi River's cut as it was at Vicksburg and the Union forces were able just to come and envelop all the armies of the West, suddenly you would have 3 Union armies against one Southern army.
When was the
surrounded.
Mississippi River cut?
Vicksburg?
Yeah. When is that? When does that happen?
July 4th.
Happens right here. How long does the war last after that?
2 more.
2 more years. 2 more years. The problem is that seems to make a great deal of sense. It absolutely does.
I mean, it ended with Sherman coming through.
Sherman ended up in North Carolina.
Right, and coming north, Army of the Potomac coming south. I mean, they were just.
When did Northern morale reach its lowest point of the war?
1864.
Summer of 64. Summer of 64. And the main reason it did is because of what was happening in Virginia. And it's because Virginia was more important in those ways. But to put us back in their place as they're making this decision on how to allocate resources, your argument is exactly the one that people made. We can't afford to lose the Mississippi River in Tennessee. We think Lee can hold on here. So let's weaken him a little bit. He's so good that he'll still be able to hold on. Let's weaken him and reinforce those people in the West. One or the other of them. One or the other. Lee had a great comment about this. He said this is a paraphrase, that's an interesting idea, he said, but he was uncertain of the application of the men who would be sent west. Which is a wonderful, understated way of saying, are you out of your mind? You're going to weaken me to reinforce Braxton Bragg? Or John C. Really? Really? I thought you, Luke, I thought you were about to say something, but you weren't. Okay, okay.
I think Lee, you mentioned last class that there was some sort of motivation to take the fight out of Virginian land.
Logistically, yes.
Logistic, because it's such a hurdle to deal with soldiers walking crops, and that potentially that there's some sort of economic incentive motive to.
He had a double edge there, actually. Take it out of Virginia to give a respite to Virginia's agriculture, but also to go get up into the United States, which was untouched by the war, and just siphon things out of the countryside there. So there are two sides to his logistical argument.
And so that makes sense to invade the north.
He thought so.
For that purpose. And
He has another argument that he makes. What did Lee say was the biggest downside of just sitting where you were after a victory? Okay, I won Chancellorsville, I'm just going to sit here and wait.
The morale of his troops.
The morale is part of it, and the other part of it is, if you're always fighting a more numerous enemy, what does just sitting give them the chance to do?
They can all just get to him and kind of get the surrounding on it. They get all their 130,000 men together against his 30s got there.
And take them wherever they want to. That's what he said. It lets them take their greater power and apply it wherever they want to, and we're just reacting then. And in the end, what did he think would be the final result of that kind of strategy? What would the end game be there? It's the thing he feared more than anything else.
Getting trapped in Richmond.
Siege.
Yeah.
He was afraid of being besieged in Richmond because he said that's something they can do really well. So if we just allow ourselves to be hemmed in Richmond, we're not going to, the end will be, they will be successful. The United States will, because they can bring their greater power to bear in just the way they want to. And in the end, of course, that's what happened to the Confederacy. He did get besieged in Richmond and Petersburg, and it ended in United States victory. So the decision to invade is partly an expression of Lee's aggressive type of leadership, I think, but it's a complicated group of factors that go into that. And the one that we haven't mentioned is that there's always a political dimension to what he wants to do, and he believed it would be very harmful to Lincoln and the Republicans if the main Confederate Army was in the United States for any period of time. That would be a real political problem for Lincoln. What is today the anniversary of? Gettysburg Address, that's right. It is indeed. 150 years. Anything else about... So, is this a good decision? I mean, I've already tipped my hand. You know that I think it's a decision that makes sense for Lee, but that doesn't mean you have to think it's. Does somebody make a really good argument about why this initial decision was a bad one to take the war into the United States?
Tried it in Antietam and it didn't work out so well for you there.
Yep.
And that was against arguably a more inept, commander. Maybe McClellan basically got lucky and won that battle. So he's at a lesser strength than he went to Antietam with, and to try the same thing again.
Well, compare the army that went to Antietam with the army that's going to go north in 1863. This is something else we need to think about.
In terms of numbers or organization?
Both. Numbers, organization, morale, command structure, you name it.
So I think command structure, the big difference is that Jackson.
Jackson's dead.
In 62?
No.
In Antietam?
No, he's alive in 62.
Right.
Yes, he is. And arresting everybody in sight. He arrests two of his division commanders, his best division commanders, he arrests on the way to Maryland. He's a sort of odd fellow, but go ahead.
So they're in the old 2-corps structure back then, and now they're in a 3-corps structure. I would imagine that the morale, though, is lower at Antietam.
Much lower. Huge straggling, huge desertion. He crossed the river with 55,000 men and got to Antietam with about 35,000. It wasn't really his army yet. So it's a huge difference. The Army's much bigger in 1863, 75,000 instead of 55,000. And it has, we've talked about this before, it has this kind of breathtaking sense of confidence in itself and in Lee. So it's a really different organization in that regard than it was in 62.
I have a question for you. You said that Lee was the only one that was like against going west or doing.
I said he was the main one,
Okay.
the one
so,
who counted.
So how did he convince? I mean, obviously there's.
Well,
how did he convince everybody else?
He didn't have to convince everybody else. He had to convince Jefferson Davis.
Okay.
And I think Jefferson Davis, to his credit, went through some of the same kinds of... Jefferson, where's Jefferson Davis from? What's his home state? Mississippi. Where is his big plantation? I'll save us the trouble. If Vicksburg falls, that's bad news for the Davis brothers. Their big holdings are on the Mississippi River. So he has a real stake in protecting Mississippi and in protecting the West. But Davis also knows that he's only got one general, whoever gives him, one army commander, who really gives him good news. And in the end, we mentioned this last time, he decides to support Lee here instead of supporting all the ones who wanted to weaken Lee and reinforce. He's the key guy. He's the key guy. And Lee persuaded him. He didn't persuade him 100%. I mentioned last time that Davis withheld a few thousand troops that Lee wanted, including 2/5 of George Pickett's division. When you get to Gettysburg, you'll talk about Armstead's brigade and Kemper's brigade and Garnett's brigade. Well, there should have been 2 more brigades there on the morning of July 3rd, but Jefferson Davis held those back in Richmond. So he's going to invade. The concentrating, why is the decision to concentrate probably less controversial than the others? What's the situation at the end of June when Lee finds out?
He doesn't know what's going on, right? I mean, he doesn't know what he's up against, or because he's kind of blind at this point.
Doesn't know where the Federal Army is really. He had a vague sense. So why would he, if you have one of your divisions on the Susquehanna River just below Harrisburg, and other ones many, many miles to the west near Chambersburg, what's the problem there?
So if the North decides that they want to fight, and their scouts know where Lee is, then they can come and they can fight a small chunk of his army.
Sure.
And pick them off one part at a time.
Piecemeal. One of the things that all Civil War generals believed, and they got this from a Swiss military thinker named Jomini, they said the best thing to do is to throw the masses of your army on the fractions of the enemy, is the way Jomini put it. Throw the masses of your army on the fractions of the enemy. So if you can find an opponent sort of spread out, that gives you a huge opening. And that's what the situation was when Lee found out where the Union Army was. And so he said, get together at Gettysburg because of all those roads that come together there that we talked about. I'm already bored with the concentrate thing. So let's move on to the things that people really like to argue about. I mean, because only a nitwit would say, let's don't concentrate. We know Lee's not a nitwit. All right. Now I want opinions about all this attacking that Lee did. He said his orders were, don't bring on a general engagement until we're all together. Those were his orders. And then what happened, Kenny?
I know A.P. Hill attacked,
He-
but wouldn't, if,
We're on July 1st now.
okay, so
Yeah.
if the Confederate armies all concentrating and started to bring us back to concentration.
They're not concentrated yet when he attacks.
But wouldn't the Federals be doing the same thing? Like, fight fire with fire? So doesn't he know that he's gonna be facing a much bigger army?
Doesn't Lee know that? Or doesn't Hill know that?
Or don't they assume that if they're concentrating elsewhere and all the roads, if you look at a map and all the roads are going to Gettysburg, wouldn't you think that they'd be thinking the same thing from the other side? Or he doesn't know what the army is?
He doesn't. He knows that he knows it's headed his way, however. Lee knows the Union Army is headed his way. We'll talk about Hill and the subordinates next time. Hill attacks because he doesn't know the Union. He doesn't think the Union Army is in Gettysburg. He thinks it's only militia that's in Gettysburg. And that's because who isn't there doing his job? I can't. Jeb Stuart is not there doing his job.
Can we talk about Lee's orders, Stuart?
We can talk about anything we want to talk
He's
about.
kind of like, go up north, but go however you want. Like, didn't the reading somewhat say that he gave him pretty much latitude? Like,
Gave him huge latitude.
so that,
So you're letting Stuart off the hook.
I'm not letting him off the hook.
I think you are letting him off the hook. I know someone being let off the hook when I see it.
So a little off the hook, but
No, he gave him very
somebody's
wide
gonna complain,
latitude.
I'm from New York.
He
so.
gave him wide latitude. But, Brian, what did Stuart know? Within that wide latitude, what is Stuart supposed to do?
So, I mean, he certainly wasn't doing what he was supposed to
No.
do in terms of screening the
And he
army.
knew what he was supposed to do.
Absolutely. But why would Lee give an order that even lets him do that and then says, like, when he's like, yeah, I'm probably going to go around the other way and say, like, okay.
That comes right to leadership style. Somebody answer Brian's question. Why did Lee give that kind of order to Jeb Stuart?
Then to Ewell.
And to Ewell?
I mean, his style was very hands-off. I mean, he would give the big order, and then he just trusted that his commanders would do the right thing, like as he would want them to do. Like he did that with Ewell. He basically said, "You decide whether to attack or not."
And but why? What is? We need to go back a little ways to understand these kinds of orders. Why would he especially be comfortable giving Jeb Stuart that order?
I think we mentioned last class, not sure, but they have been fighting together for a long time in the same
Yes.
kind of process or hands-off
Exactly right.
mold and stuff.
Yes, exactly right. Those are the kinds of, when the Army command was Jackson and Longstreet, each commanding half of the infantry, and Jeb Stuart commanding the cavalry, that is how they operated. Very general orders. I want you to accomplish A, Alex, and so go do it. And Brandon, I want you to do B. You go do it. And you're Jeb Stuart, and you know what you're supposed to do. I don't care how you do it. But we both know what I want you to do. That has been his style of command all the way through his tenure as Army commander. A very loose rein on his subordinates, very wide latitude to them. And he is simply, in the Gettysburg campaign, continuing that style of leadership. And as we'll see next time, he finds out it doesn't work anymore when he has different people. Allison, and then, well, I don't care which. Allison, and then Luke, and then back to Brian.
Isn't Jeb's job always to communicate, though?
It's always
like
his-
He was gone and like no messages from him for like a month almost.
That's always his job, and it's not almost.
Regardless of how he interpreted the message, shouldn't he have been communicating what he was doing or what he was saying?
Yes, he should. Yes, yeah, yes, absolutely. And Alan Nolan's article does a nice job of saying that. I mean, Alan reprints the orders to Jeb Stuart and essentially argues Alan was a very good lawyer. He was the senior partner in the largest law firm in Indiana, and on the law review at Harvard, a really smart guy, but he was a lawyer instead of a historian, and he could make a good argument, but I think without really focusing on the essential point that both Lee and Stuart knew what Stuart was supposed to do. How he did it is another question, but what he did was not, they were not confused about that. They were not confused about that. Luke, you had your hand up.
I had two questions.
Uh-huh.
First, one of the articles implied that Lee still did have cavalry with him?
He did.
And
The wretched refuse of the cavalry division was with him.
which just kind of got hung in like the side of his flanks and in his rear. He never used them.
Yeah, let me say one thing about one of the brigadiers that Jeb Stuart left behind with the Army. The biggest cavalry battle of the war is the Battle of Brandy Station, which is up near Culpeper. We said last time, you drive right through the middle of it every time you go on 29 North. In that battle, the biggest cavalry battle of the war, Beverly Robertson, a brigadier general from North Carolina, suffered no casualties in that battle. Not one casualty in that battle. He managed to disappear entirely in that battle. Jeb Stuart leaves him behind with the Army. He leaves a big brigade commanded by a guy named Jenkins that's made up of this wretchedly undisciplined ridiculous cavalry from the Shenandoah Valley. They have absolutely no discipline. They don't even really, they're ridiculous. He leaves them behind. He does leave one good officer behind, a guy named Grumble Jones. His nickname was Grumble. That wasn't what his parents named him. His name was William E. Jones, but his nickname was Grumble. He and Stuart hated each other, and so Stuart left him behind. Jones was at the very back of the Army doing a very good job. But the point is, Stuart took his best subordinates and his best units with him. And so yes, Lee had some cavalry. He didn't have any in front of A.P. Hill on July 1st, but he did have some cavalry. Brian, you had your hand up too.
Oh, I guess like the follow-up to that was, it seems like in each of these cases, or in some of the cases, Lee had a pretty strong preference as to how he wanted the person to go about, or like Stuart to go about and do what he wanted to do, or Ewell or Longstreet later on. But he still like kind of gives them the complete latitude and then just gets really mad at them afterwards. Was that?
Well, he gave
consistent.
He didn't realize he didn't realize until well along that Stuart wasn't doing his job, and then he did get upset about it. Yeah, he did. I wish we had a transcript of what he said to Stuart when they had their meeting on July. I'd really love to. Recording would be better, but just a transcript would be fun. Yes, he was really upset. Ewell, he didn't know, but he had figured him out, he thought, by July the 2nd, and he never trusted him again. And he treated him differently after that. At first he treats him the way he would have treated Stonewall Jackson, then he doesn't anymore. Longstreet, I think, was a mystery to Lee, because Longstreet had never behaved this war. We'll talk more about that next time. Kyle?
So I understand that both Lee and Stuart knew what he was supposed to do, but hadn't, and I might be confusing fact and fiction here, but hadn't Stuart shown some tendencies in the past to kind of go astray and not do things exactly how he would want?
Well, he didn't really go astray. He'd shown a tendency to do things in as flamboyant a fashion as possible. He had done that before, but he really delivered. I mean, and he did a good job early in the campaign, fighting in the gaps as they went north. There was a lot of fighting in the gaps of the Blue Ridge as Lee's army went north. It's when they got to the point where those fights were over, and then that's when Stuart began his adventure, which didn't last. I mean, it didn't last a month, didn't last from the beginning of the campaign, just took place in a really critical part of the campaign.
I guess I'm just thinking about it a little bit from the business perspective as well,
Mm-hmm.
where you see a lot of times that someone can have tremendous results, but they have a tendency to do things in not the greatest of ways, and if you don't address them, it often results in disaster in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess in looking at this, why would Lee, as being such a strong leader, not see some of this coming and start to manage him in a different type of way?
Somebody respond to that.
Because it had worked every time before. I think it's the best way I can probably explain it.
Is it because it was just a 3 or 4 days period of time when everything happened? So I guess
A little longer than that, but not very long. I mean, we're talking about a relatively very short time compared to the history of Stuart with Lee, which stretched back about a year at this point. Jeff, and then Graham, and then Caroline.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like this whole time their morale's great, they're sort of on the upswing, things are going right, and so it seems like he's just kind of saying, hey, things are sort of going my way, let's ride this wave.
Even Ewell was doing well going north. He won a battle at Winchester. So I think that's true.
Well, yeah, the other thing I was thinking was that the people he's got a sort of proven track record with is probably going to spend less time focusing on those and focus more on the people he's got the newbies.
Yeah.
And so it seems to me that that's the sort of the focus of his attention, particularly at Gettysburg, because he's not worried about what Longstreet's doing, but he's assuming he's going to do what he's meant to do. And so you can't have attention on everything at once. So I think his attention somewhat.
I honestly think, Kyle, that as Lee got his 2 hours of sleep each night, the very last thing he would have worried about going north would have been whether Jeb Stuart would do his job or not. I just don't think that would be I mean, we all have had, or at least you will have, and many of you probably already have had. I mean, I've run a big department in my life, and there are people that you just count on because they've always produced, and so you don't worry about them. And then there are other people who are more problematical, and one really problematical person takes 10 times as much attention as one person who does their job really well. It's just the way life is. 2 really bad people can, out of 50, can occupy 50% of your time. I just think Stewart would have been one of those people Lee would have just assumed he's going to do his job, because he's always done his job. Why wouldn't he do his job? And then he never did this again. He did it this one time. Never did it again, but he did it here.
I think Caroline was next. but I
I
have a
was just
question.
saying that, right?
Okay. So I'm willing to give Lee a pass on the managerial style for Stewart.
We don't need to give him a pass. Hammer him.
But even if I can concede that when we get to the attack aspect, which I think is where you're headed, it's where it falls apart for me. So
Okay.
I'd love to hear an argument that says you should take the tactical offensive once you've chosen to already.
Why don't you
engage.
first make the argument that he shouldn't do that?
You're occupying federal land. You're already accomplishing your goal of removing the Army from Virginia. You're
Yep.
already beginning to, inflict morale consequences, on kind of the public. So.
And you're gathering huge amounts of supplies.
Huge amounts of resources.
Yep.
So what is to prevent you from, in the best case scenario, picking an ideal spot? Maybe it's the high ground in Gettysburg, maybe it's somewhere else, and creating an entrenched defensive position for your army and telling the opposing force to come meet you on their own ground.
They could triple your numbers with that, like just demolish you with your numbers.
They have a lot more numbers, but not triple. But there are more. That's a powerful case that Michael has laid out there. He could even defend the gaps in South Mountain. Why even go? I mean, once the Army's back in place, just protect that and keep taking stuff out of the Cumberland Valley.
So, other than Antietam, this scenario is played out a number of times. The Federals have more people every time Lee whips them. The Southern Infantry is clearly better than the Northern Infantry, and he feels like he's got a better...
Boy, the Iron Brigade wouldn't agree with that.
Well, from Lee's
I'm teasing you.
Is that he's got better infantry than
Yes.
them, and he owns them. I mean, he knows he's in their head, I think.
Of course he does. No.
Especially
Yes, he does.
I mean, Hooker, Pope, it's just a series of misfit generals. They can't fight a battle, and they just keep getting beat by him. So why wouldn't you? I mean, you own their number. You've owned their number for a year. I mean, just play this out again. McClellan just got lucky and he beat him.
So it's just classic overconfidence?
I don't think it's overconfidence.
But Michael, what's the key point on July 1st? I mean, when you say that Lee, the battle starts, where's Lee when the battle starts on July 1st? Is he there? No. He comes up, gets up early in the afternoon. I mean, he doesn't wake up early in the afternoon. He gets to the battlefield early, and what does he see when he gets there? What's the situation?
He at the Seminary Ridge, overlooking the battle, seeing Phil being attacked pretty heavily. You're one ridge off, but yes, that's what he sees. He comes up to her ridge and sees pressure that Hill is applying pressure to John Reynolds is dead, but Reynolds' First Corps. But then what does he see? And that's when the battle's like this. I'm the Union, you are the Confederates attacking me from the west, and Matt, you're Lee, and I'll get to your question in just a second. So you come on the field, and what happens shortly after you get on the field?
That's when he sees the opportunity to take them out.
That's when Robert Rhodes shows up on my flank. Yes, and so the whole tactical situation changes then, and that's what persuades Lee to go from let's don't bring on a general engagement to I couldn't have ordered up better circumstances than this. You all are keeping my attention right on you, and now here comes one of Richard Ewell's divisions. And then when we try to shift around and meet them, here comes another one of Ewell's divisions, even farther around our flank. So that's the decision that we need to critique on the first day, is his decision at that moment to push the offensive. So let's talk about that. But that still comes after your argument that he should have never even been going that way. Hill and Harry Heath are really responsible for the initial fight. Lee didn't even know what was happening there. That was Heath and Hill decided to do that.
Is it okay to focus? Are we going to focus
We can
on-
focus on anything,
Okay.
Jeb. Just
Yeah,
you're like Jeb Stewart. You have very wide latitude to go wherever you want to go here.
Congrats. I'm going to use that privilege, just like Jeb Stewart. So for day 2, the decision to attack that day, I think, is really interesting, and it sounds
And
like
that decision is made on day 1
okay.
to attack on day 2. So now we're talking about the follow-up. There's been this great tactical success on July 1. And the Confederates hold Seminary Ridge, and they hold the town. And now the decision is, do we fight on the offensive, or do we hunker down and have them attack us?
And is there a precedent for attacking sort of a well-entrenched position and having that be successful? I mean, it just seems like if I'm given the choice between lining up all my guys and walking towards someone who's behind a stone wall and so that they can shoot at me in a way that there's no way they could possibly miss.
Right.
I would choose the
Okay.
other one.
First of all, we know that the Federals ended up behind a stone wall and the Confederates. So don't judge Lee's decision knowing what we know. Do it knowing what he knew. And so, what does he know at the end of the first day's fighting? What does he absolutely know at the end of the first day?
At least some of the northern units just lost a fight and are running backwards with Lay-Downs.
He knows he's crushed 2 Union Corps. He knows that because they've captured thousands of prisoners from them. They know which 2 corps. They know the 1st and the 11th Corps have had a really bad day and have retreated to the high ground south of Gettysburg. That's what he knows. What doesn't he know? What are some things he doesn't know?
Where the rest of the Union Army is.
Doesn't know how much. He doesn't know where the rest of the Union Army is, whether it's 1 day away or 2 days away or 4 hours away. So he does not know that. Marcus.
So is that the main difference between the Chancellor fight and the Gettysburg fight? That did he know more about the grounds and also the number of armies from the Union, or?
The principal difference between Chancellorsville and Gettysburg is that Gettysburg, Lee was in a much more desperate situation. And he had fewer options, actually, and especially on the day of the biggest fighting, because his army was divided into 3 pieces and he needed to get the pieces back together. And that's why he assaulted there. He's not under the gun that way at Gettysburg. His army's intact. He doesn't have to fight to get his army together there. He's got it there. They're on a good position. They're on Seminary Ridge. That's a good, strong position. Feeding into Michael's argument. He knows that too. He knows he's in a good position. Alex?
I was going to say, doesn't he also know that Meade has to attack if he just sits there?
That's a great question. And let's have some. I have a very firm answer in my own mind to that. Why wouldn't he know that? It's the evening of July 1st. He's won this big tactical victory on July 1st. What would Meade's position be? I mean, what kinds of pressures would be on Meade at that point? Laura?
I mean, I think he's still, because he just started.
He's been in command 3 days. 3 days. But what are the pressures on him? What could Lee assume? What kinds of orders could Lee assume Meade has from Washington? What would his goals be?
Definitely driving them out of Gettysburg.
Get the rebels out of Pennsylvania. I mean, that's going to be their number 1 goal. And in order to do that, what do you have to do? You have to take the offensive. So my answer is, I think Lee, he pretended in his official report that the onus was on him, Lee, to attack. I think he is dissembling there. I really do. That he had to know the onus was on Meade to get him out of Pennsylvania. Politically, you can't leave the biggest rebel army on United States soil. You cannot do that. So I think that's another thing he really knew. He really knew that if he hunkered down, he would probably get attacked.
Well, didn't you mention one of the previous weeks that Meade was a McClellan?
Very much.
So, what's to say that he's not going to play out of McClellan's playbook and basically demand more forces, sit there, stall,
Well,
and only when Abraham Lincoln basically jumps on him does he actually do it? I mean, that's
But even with McClellan, what did McClellan do when Lee what was the result of Lee going into Maryland and McClellan being his opponent?
Yeah, but I mean,
What was the result?
it was a victory, but
Well, no. The result was the bloodiest day in American history. So McClellan did attack. He did attack Lee.
yeah, with a lot of prodding.
Yes, exactly, with a lot of prodding. And I think Lee probably could have guessed that there would be prodding again, this time prodding Meade to get the rebels out of the United States. We don't know that because he never said, I knew that or I thought that. And in his report he said he assumed the opposite. I don't believe that, but that doesn't mean I'm right. And he didn't really have some kind of, maybe he was on Vicodin on the night of July 1st and really couldn't focus. Any other variables in place that we need to be aware of, Matt, on July 1st?
So I know the guys went down into Gettysburg looking for shoes, but what was the general kind of supply situation for?
Lee's army's in great shape. Absolutely great shape. Yes, great shape. It is at apogee in terms of confidence, equipment. I mean, it's a stunningly confident and optimistic army.
But are they prepared for a 4-day siege? Because towards the end, a lot of the readings that we've had say make it sound like they're out of ammunition.
Well, they didn't know they were going to be, I mean, they fight the biggest battle of the war. So yes, they run through. Their artillery, Porter Alexander, a great artillerist, of course, focuses on that like a laser beam. He can just, you can see in his mind the stocks of ammunition. He knows how much there is, how much it takes to keep these guns firing, and he's really worried about it. Really worried about it. And that you can't get from the Pennsylvania countryside. You can't get more canister rounds from Chambersburg. So you've got to, so that is a problem. So does somebody want to make the case? Michael's made the case for why Lee should have assumed the defensive after the first day. Somebody make the opposite case. Matt and Allison are going to do this. This will be a tag team defensive Lee.
I guess the one thing I think Lee considers is Meade's third day or fourth day. Now you look at this, and he just got punched in the mouth, and he doesn't have a clue what's going on. And so part of from Lee's perspective is, if I've got him a little bit on the ropes, and yet maybe I don't know where the rest of the troops are, but if I've got him scrambled, I can get in there and get this thing done. Lee, he's got some great qualities, and part of his qualities is he's the empire building kind of guy. He wants to have that decisive victory and claim it for himself. That's the mentality I think he's got. And so he's got a chance to put him on the ropes and finish the job, and he's going to go in and do it. And so that's his rationale for going after B.
Okay, so you've had a great success on the first day. Turn it into a greater one.
Yeah, just keep pushing.
I think building on that, his men are like really pumped up, ready to go. They're feeling good, so morale is really high. So I think kind of feeding off that energy, it was like, well, now is the time to make our mark in this war and attack.
I think you two have those are the two principal ways to understand Lee's momentum and morale. I think that's it. That is how you understand why Lee did what he did. Those are the factors. He understands how important momentum is. He's seen it on other battlefields. And he absolutely knows and understands how important the bond he had with his men were. So I think that's how you explain it. That is, I really think that's the answer. The question is, should that be more important than all the things that Michael raised? And now hands go up in every direction.
Well, just kind of building on the idea of momentum, like we said, there was this concern about the Union Army getting more strength and kind of getting more power into that. So could there possibly be an idea that Lee should attack before that happens? Like he knows what he's got right now and saying, okay, if I attack now, I at least know what I have before.
What does he know? We're talking about what he knows. He knows there are X number of Federals on the field on the night of July 1st. He doesn't know what that number is, but X. On July 2nd, is it going to be X minus or X plus?
It could be X plus.
Oh, no, it will be X plus. It will be X plus because the Federals are coming that way.
It's not going to be like X times 100.
No, just more. Just more.
Okay.
He's sure that that will be the case, that there'll be more. Doesn't know how many more. Doesn't know how many are there. But he knows that his army's not going to get any stronger, and the Union Army is going to get stronger because they're coming up.
I think also to go along with that, if Meade is, kind of a McClellan's likeness, and Lee goes into the defensive, Meade probably won't attack until he knows that he has the overwhelming, manpower and,
Even though he's being pushed. Yes. I think that's right.
So he knows if he goes into the defensive, like you're saying, his army's not going to get bigger, but Meade's not going to attack until he has everything in place, and overwhelming manpower in order to, make that attack. So, it's not very.
Okay, we've got
situation.
Jeff, one more, and then I want to get a sense of the room in terms of what Lee's decision. Yes, go ahead.
I guess how clear was it, or was it clear that the situation had changed drastically from day one to day two? That where they had just a great position on day one, did they realize that the position they had on day two wasn't, or the position that Meade had on day two was more defensible, or?
Well, the position is, that doesn't change. You could see then. We can't see now as well as they could see then because the town's grown up. You could see that ground and see what the key ground was. And the Federals had it on the night of the 1st, and the Federals had it on the 2nd. And Lee's plan on the 2nd was to knock them off of it. That doesn't really change. That's a factor that remains constant.
Is it truth or myth that he gets the report on the morning of the 2nd that the little round top end of the line is unoccupied? Does he get a report from the...
Yeah, he had a staff officer go out before daylight who rode down to that end of the line and saw that there were no Federals there, saw that the Federal line ended on Cemetery Ridge, a little south of Cemetery Hill. So Lee's plan was to attack up the axis, use the axis of the Emmitsburg Road. So here is Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, there's Little Round Top, and here's Culp's Hill. Lots of CHs. Anyway, the staff officer rode out here and saw there was nobody at Little Round Top, nobody in what we now call the Peach Orchard, nobody in what we call the wheat field, that the Union line came down and stopped here. And here's the Emmitsburg Road coming into town. Lee's orders were to attack using the Emmitsburg Road as his axis of advance. So the original plan is to move up the road that way, which of course takes the Union line in flank. To come back to our very first question of the day. That's the last intelligence he had. By the time Longstreet got down there, as we've already talked about, which we can talk about later, that intelligence isn't accurate anymore. And especially when Dan Sickles moves off of Cemetery Ridge and occupies the Peach Orchard line. But anyway, that's his original intelligence. So that's not a myth. No, that's true. He had a staff officer named Johnston who rode out there early in the morning, very early in the morning. But how are we going to judge Lee's decision now? Michael votes bad decision. How does Porter Alexander vote? What does he say Lee should have done?
I don't know.
He says he should have hunkered down after the first big victory on July 1st and made the Yankees attack him. He said there's not the slightest chance they could have driven us, Alexander speaking, off Seminary Ridge. No chance. That's what he said after he'd gotten to see the whole battlefield. So he votes with you. He's a really smart guy and a very aggressive guy too.
It's kind of interesting that a lot of the essays in one collection talk about, given what Lee knew at the time and the situation he was faced with, that we're kind of attacking on some of those defenses that make more sense. But he didn't know, didn't have his cavalry in place to find out where the other federal troops were. And so he has them on the ropes, he can go in and get it done now. So in the situation where he was, amped up, got morale, got munitions, let's go, it makes kind of sense then. And so it's now in hindsight, we get to judge what he's done.
Of course. That's
making a decision based out of passion, not out of tactics, not waiting until he has his cavalry report back on knowing where the troops are. Maybe he was smarter to defend, he knew Meade had to come after him, but You know, that's always easy to say looking at it now, but I think, you know, where he was sitting then, it makes a lot of sense to go after it.
There's a vote for Lee. We haven't even mentioned Longstreet. He and Longstreet had their first tense meeting. They had 3 tense meetings, one every day. They had their first one about 5 in the afternoon on July 1st, standing there on Seminary Ridge, and Lee announces that the enemy is still there tomorrow. We're going to attack him. And what is Longstreet's response to that? He does not want to do that. He wants to disengage. He doesn't want to just hunker down and defend Deer. He wants to disengage, move around, and find an even better position to defend. That's Longstreet's argument.
I just think that from someone observing it, even historically, the general has to have the wherewithal to take a step back, surely, just as the CEO does, and take passion and emotion out of it and do what's strategically right. So I understand what you're saying, Matt, but it seems from a political angle, there's so many angles, including the political angle here, where entrenching made much more sense, that it strikes me as crazy that he wouldn't have taken that moment.
I need to say one thing here, Graham. We're pre-entrenching. You're going to see some very rude, but you mean just hunkering down and say attack us. Yeah, right.
I mean,
right.
There was so much to be gained from that, and it seemed like fairly marginal benefit. Even if they had won, the losses would have still been severe. And that was, the point was made quite clearly that the losses were going to be large, irrespective of the eventual outcome of that.
What would likely have happened, I hate counterfactuals, so let's go down that road. What likely would have happened if they had succeeded in knocking the Federals all the way off the high ground on July 2nd? What happens then?
There's another round of Federals waiting for them, you know that.
Now what do the Federals do? What did Meade already plan to do? He had another line prepared down along the Monocacy River, the Pipe Creek line. Lee is not going to destroy the Army of the Potomac. That does not happen on Civil War battlefields. You don't destroy another army. So it would have been bad news for the United States, but it wouldn't have been the end of the Army of the Potomac. Allison, and then Caroline.
It would have been a huge battle for Lee to win, and from what I was reading and my interpretation of it, there was a strong chance that he could have taken it, and if he was going to win a battle against this army, this was a good opportunity for him to do it in the North. So the impact of going forward and having that win, I mean, talking about like ending the war.
That magnifies the impact. The fact that it's in Pennsylvania magnifies the impact.
So, I mean, I'm with Matt and supporting Lee because the impact of a win would just be so big for the Confederate Army, and at the time, he thought he could do it.
Caroline, and then back to Graham.
I was just going to counter what you said earlier, Graham, about taking the emotion out of it. I think you can say that looking at the momentum of morale and the emotion of the troops is very different than the emotion of him as a general himself. And I mean, going back to what Allison and Matt said, it seems like you build on the emotion of the troops, and you can get that win to have the most impact.
Agreed, but the win doesn't change the course of anything in the scheme of things. It gives, in my view, it would have been a further building of morale and momentum, but the Union would have still kept coming, just as you mentioned. And then you've decimated your army to a certain extent, like in this battle.
Well, politically, it would have been really bad for Lincoln. I mean, it would have really been bad for Lincoln.
Sort of setting up sort of defensive position and then staying there for another month or 6 weeks, would that not be more damaging to Lincoln than just this one?
Just the presence.
Right, and so that, from my perspective, seems to be more damaging, and you can inflict more, especially in the sort of the court public opinion through something like that, than you can in one battle.
I love it. Yes. Do you all want to go in at one time? Very quickly, and then we're going to move to the second day. We're going to come 1, 2, 3, 4.
I mean, even if he goes into the defensive, it doesn't mean he's going to be able to hold off the Army of the Potomac forever. So, I mean, eventually there's going to be an engagement, and he's probably saying, let's do it now when they're not reinforced and have, this great game plan, and Meade's been in command for a month. Let's do it now when he's been for
Meade's
3
been in
days.
command 3 days.
Yeah, they're spread out. So instead of giving them time to mass, they're still going to, probably have an engagement even if they're in the defense.
Another thing that Lee knows, and we need to factor this in, the Army of the Potomac has 90,000 men at Gettysburg. There are another 70,000 United States troops at Washington. And Washington is not that far away. And so that's another piece of this that's worth keeping in mind. That I mean, if you have a chance on the ground against this force, that's something he would think about, Graham. I'm not voting here. I'm just saying that he would think about that.
He's still, he's also blind, so if he hunkers down the defense, he's still Meade can start moving around, and he's not gonna have
Yep.
a good sense of where Meade's coming from, and is blind. And I think, to Caroline's point, I think that when you have an enemy on the ropes like this, I mean, your natural impulse is to finish them all.
That's Lee's natural impulse.
Well, it's his, but I mean, that's just, I think.
No, it's-
Militarily, if you've won repeatedly battle after battle, and this is third one in a row,
Yep.
the impetus is, let's finish this now. I mean, you psychologically, you're gonna win.
So this is the whole point of kind of invading the North, is to kind of like following the war, make it really tough for them, and make them now want to fight politically. Now, I think to Graham's point, the whole point of this is just to prolong this as long as you can. And even if they won, then they would have decimated half their army, and it would have been crippled, and would have taken even longer. So I think that, yeah, it would have been a good like political thing, but there wasn't even an election for a year and a half in the U.S., so he would have, or Lincoln would have time to recover, even if they won the battle.
Yeah, we don't know that, but I mean, we can. That's a reasonable argument. We don't know. We have other days to move on to, and Meade. I just want to show of hands. How many people think the decision to continue the assault was good? I'm really surprised. And bad? It's almost evenly split. That's really interesting. It's now July 2nd. The fighting is very heavy, as we know. Lee comes close on Little Round Top, comes close on Culp's Hill, comes close on Cemetery Ridge. Close. His subordinates don't do very well. We'll talk about that next time. It's now the night of July 2nd. Thousands more casualties. Now he knows where the Federal Army is. It's on the famous Fishhook line. The whole thing is apparent now, from anchored at Little Round Top and Round Top at one end, Culp's Hill on the other end. Lee decides that night to attack again on July 3rd. Let's talk about that. Michael.
It's just like, it's idiotic if you stand.
Now wait, okay, let's stop for a second. Do you think Lee was an idiot?
No.
Okay, so maybe not idiotic.
Okay, maybe it was a gross error.
Miscalculation.
Yes.
Okay.
To stand at the bottom and look up at Cemetery Ridge and think that you can march an entire line of men.
Wait. First of all, we need to get the Pickett Pettigrew. What is Lee's initial plan for the attacks on July 3rd? I saw you started your dismissive look. I saw that coming, Michael, but what is his original plan? Is it Pickett's charge?
No.
No. What is it?
It's to go...
It's the same thing he did on the second.
Day 2 with Culp's Hill and...
It's pressure here and there simultaneously. So let's talk about that. No, I mean, that can still be an idiotic decision to do that again after what's happened. So that's his decision that night. Continue. What is he thinking about now?
So I'm getting confused on the dates. Which is the day that Longstreet didn't start fighting until 4? Was that on
That's the second. We sped dial past that.
Okay.
That's the second. So all that heavy fighting down on the southern end of the line that you'll go over with the Marines, the wheat field, the peach orchard, Devil's Den, Little Round Top, all of that is on July 2nd. That's all James Longstreet's 2 divisions. They suffer 30% casualties in that fighting. And Pickett isn't up yet. He's the last fresh unit in the Army. He gets up in time for the 3rd. But he's the smallest division in the Army, too. Okay, Michael.
So, what would you like me to do?
I want you to talk about whether it made sense for him to try to reprise what he had done. I mean, I know you're going to say no because you didn't think it was a good idea the first time, but is it an even worse idea now?
No, it's a worse idea. So I think a lot of it is driven particularly from Lee with pride in having not accomplished what he wanted to on day 2. And you're looking at further entrenched positions and sending up, in a lot of instances, many of the same units that previously were failed to achieve their objective on day 2. You're now telling them to try and achieve the same objective on day 3, knowing that the Union now knows that assault is probably coming.
To counter that, I mean, I think what Lee was thinking is that, end of the second day, that was hard fighting for both sides, and that his army still has a good amount of morale. And I'm thinking he's counting that if he pushes them again, they'll break. And I think that he just underestimated the negative impact that morale could have. I mean, you have the Army of the Potomac, they're kind of used to losing at this point, so bad morale doesn't.
What's
make it
another
right.
loss? That's right. Part of it is that they, go ahead, Brandon.
I was going to say, so Michael, I agree with you. I think the logic, though, does make a little more sense than being a terribly gross miscalculation. And that he's thinking, with their interior line, the worst thing that can happen is that they reinforce each other as you strike one and then the other. And what happened on the first day, he's thinking, it just wasn't timed right. We hit one, and then that stopped, and then we hit another.
That was the second day you're
That was
talking
the
about.
second day.
So
he's thinking,
he
if
got
we just-
no coordination on the
Right.
second day, which he found very frustrating. And it started late. And, so go ahead.
So I was going to say, so I think part of what he was thinking is, if I can get it to happen at the exact same time, then it prevents them from being able to reinforce either wing. And that was just the failure of the second day. So I'm not necessarily I am trying the same thing again, but I'm just hoping to get more coordination this time.
Anybody else want to weigh in here, Caroline?
I was just gonna say, if you give somebody a task and they aren't able to achieve it, and you give them a second chance, I think they might be even more motivated to achieve it. And so if you do get the timing right, you have the increased morale to be able to achieve the same thing you failed at before.
Kyle?
There's another thing I want to go against on going back into the same folks on the next day, from the federal side at least, is they're so tightly coordinated there, concentrated there, that they were replacing all of those lines. They weren't going to face the same people on the next day. It was to be fresh troops that don't have low morale. And by the way, the night before was actually, I mean, in their terms, basically a victory. They stopped them from from flanking them on Culp's Hill, and that I think their morale is actually much higher than the Confederate side. So I would think that it's actually even tougher to go into a group that finally has stood up to you, and they actually have some confidence now in being able to fight you off again.
Support for Michael there. So we're, any other factors we're leaving out here in his decision that night? Alex?
I guess just, I mean, these two, I mean, Longstreet and Ewell, the troops and the divisions that were involved were just decimated in the second day. And especially, I mean, how many generals did he lose?
A bunch.
Yeah, a lot, right?
Yes.
And so...
And there are many more who will go down on the third.
Right, and so to ask that the same troops to then, first thing the next morning, conduct an assault might have been a little bit...
That sounds that way to us, but it happens all the time in the Civil War. All the time in the Civil War. The poor 26th North Carolina, we mentioned them before, and you should be on the lookout for their monument. It's the biggest regiment in the Confederate Army. They fought on July 1st on McPherson's Ridge, and there were 800 men in the regiment. They suffered 80% casualties on July 1st. And then they take part in Pickett's charge, Pickett-Pettigrew assault. So that's not something, Longstreet argued to a degree on the morning of the 3rd that the two divisions that had fought so hard on the 2nd shouldn't carry most of the water on the 3rd. Hood's division and McLaws' division, and Hood had been wounded, of course. He's one of the guys who'd gotten wounded. But that's not why Lee changes his plan. He changes his plan partly because the Federals attack over on the right too soon. So now we fast forward a little ways. Now he decides on plan B, the Pickett-Pettigrew assault. Somebody other than Michael talk about why that doesn't make any sense. That's got about 12,000 men who are going to assault the center of the Union line, the key part of Cemetery Ridge, just south of Cemetery Hill, so in like this, preceded by this big bombardment. Caroline.
I forget which of the authors said this, but attacking at that point meant that the Federals can attack you from all around, whereas if you would attack still on the sides, you'd really only be attacking a point, would be able to do the same thing back to them.
Yep. Anybody want to step up and defend this? Look at this.
I mean,
the
I'm not saying I
forlorn
agree
hope.
with it. I mean, to Kyle's point, they've been hitting on the far, kind of the far flanks of each line. Presumably, if they're reinforcing those points, they must be, pulling men maybe from the middle of the line, so you could make a case that, the center of the Union line could theoretically be a weakened point at this point. So if you just throw everything you have on it, you've been there, it's a pretty impressive attack also to make. So, I think he's just trying to play upon, Union morale again. To Cal's point, they might have been bolstered a little bit, but they're still kind of afraid of Lee at this point, so.
Kyle?
Or disclaimer, I don't agree with the attack, but terrain-wise, that is the most favorable. Like, it's the least steep of the terrain you're going up.
Oh, yeah, it's just barely a rise. It's just barely.
I think that's the misperception is like Colpsdale and Lower Round Top are like
They're
going
hills.
uphill. There, it's a gentle rise, so
Yeah.
it's not like they're sending up straight up a mountain, and there's not a lot of ground for them to really fortify. It's like a gentle rise and like a little, I don't know, just a flat area. So there's not a lot of area for them to dig in or anything. So terrain-wise, if you're going to attack, that's the best place, most favorable terrain to attack into.
So I was thinking, so if it's not that way, because we all disagree with that, Alexander says to go from the top of the fish. I think he says at one point, like,
What Alexander saw later, of course, and this is a wonderful.
after, right?
Alexander's account makes one thing really clear that we should always keep in mind, that soldiers only see part of a battlefield, and the only part of the battlefield Alexander had seen, he'd been down here with his artillery. He hadn't seen how the Union line was really put together, and what he said when he finally got to the field and could look at the whole field, he said, this should have been the point of attack because you can bring artillery to bear on that point from three sides. Whereas the artillery bombardment that preceded the actual attack on the 3rd is just from one direction. You could get a converging fire on that. And he said that seems to him, in retrospect, to have made much more sense than what they did. And he didn't understand it during the battle because he hadn't seen it. But afterward he said, of course, Lee knew that. So, he's a very harsh critic of Lee in a lot of ways at Gettysburg. Alexander is. If you haven't read it, and I can understand why maybe you haven't, and if you do have any interest in this, you should really read Alexander. It's in a class all by itself among all the hundreds of books written by former Confederates. He's the most analytical, he's the most dispassionate, partly because he wrote it for his family and not with the intent of publishing it. But he says, yes, as an artillerist, that's where the attack should have been because Confederate artillery could have been brought to bear from three sides there. The downside of that, though, is, however, that's a real hill.
Right.
Cemetery Hill's a real
can
hill.
they not just keep supporting themselves with interior lines because they have the entire support going back the other.
No.
So I understand that point from the artillery perspective, and that's obviously his background, but would that have been any, do you think that could have been any more successful? So, that was
I
just,
don't. No.
if I'm going to lose one way, he'd rather lose going hills and
I think
going
the thing we need to try to understand here is why did Lee do this? Again, we can't assume Lee's a really smart guy. He really is. He had plenty of IQ. Is this just inexplicable? Or is there some way to understand it? Is it ego? Which is sort of what Michael is suggesting, Alex, and then Jeff and Brandon?
I do get the sense, I don't know if I call it overconfidence, but I think he did.
Call it overconfidence.
Yeah, okay. He was overconfident in what his men could accomplish.
The confidence is in his men.
Right.
Yeah.
And in what I've read about Chancellorsville, what they did there was unbelievable.
And how long ago was that?
And that was just 2 months prior.
Exactly 2 months. It's exactly 2 months.
And these are the same men.
They are.
And,
yeah.
And so I guess an attack of this, even though, and for many, in all objective purposes, doesn't necessarily make logical sense when you stack it all up. If you think that your men can really smash that line in the ways that they did at Chancellorsville, and
it gains his mill.
Yeah.
And at Second Bull Run. History does come in here a little bit. Brandon, Jeff?
Oh, no,
that was
the exact point.
Okay.
When I think his explanation in one of our readings, when he talks about the battle afterwards, he talks about how he finally asked too much of his men.
No, he said it twice. He said it to Jefferson Davis and said it to his wife within a few days. And he said exactly the same thing, that he simply asked the men to do too much. And he wouldn't have asked them to do it if he didn't think they could do it. I don't think there's any question about that. I think that is the answer. I don't think it's a complicated answer why Lee decided on this. I don't think it's complicated. I think it's overconfidence. But it's confidence based on something. It's not confidence, it's not kind of nutty confidence. It's confidence based on what he had seen this infantry do, not once, but repeatedly, in very difficult situations. And most recently, exactly 2 months before at Chancellorsville. Kyle?
So I just pose the question is, whether they can do this or not, is this a better choice than moving somewhere else and
Right.
fighting the battle on your own terms when you should literally destroy the
Yeah,
families? I mean,
so that is it. I mean, that's the other side of this question. Is it, so okay, we kind of understand why he did this, but wouldn't it have been better to just hunker down on Seminary Ridge and tell Meade to come get me? How many times had the Army of the Potomac driven the Army of Northern Virginia from a battlefield? Never. Had never done it. Didn't drive them from the battlefield at Antietam even. They had never driven them from a battlefield. Which is Porter Alexander's point. We might fail to take a position, he said. We never failed to defend a position. Jeff?
Is there, the one sort of logical thing that I'm trying to see if it works in here is timing? Like, time, it's really not on your side because they have so many.
They're always getting stronger.
Yeah, exactly.
No, Lee talked about that all the time. Every day that goes by, every month that goes by, every year that goes by, we are relatively weaker. Even if we don't fight any battles, we're relatively weaker. So yes, he had that kind of clock is ticking in his head. Last thoughts about, we've spent an hour and 15 minutes on Lee, and Meade's going to get 15 minutes. That's how it usually breaks down. That's about the way it usually breaks down. Any last thoughts about Ari Lee? Emily?
I was just kind of frustrated for Longstreet on day 3 because I felt like this whole time, like he kind of was strongly opposed to all this attacks.
That's such a gentle way to put it. Yes, he was really strongly opposed to this.
And I felt like Lee came to him for affirmation for this attack on day 3, and this is when, Longstreet was really, really adamantly opposed, and it just kind of cut him off and was like, well, we're just going to do this. And I understand having to make quick decisions, but it seemed like, I was just wondering about their relationship, because he was supposed to be, his right-hand man, and I felt like he didn't really listen to his opinion at all.
Well, I think he listened to we'll talk much more about this next time, but I think he listened to his opinion, he just didn't agree with it. And we've all had discussions with bosses and probably voiced our opinion, and if the boss doesn't agree with us, our opinion doesn't carry the day, and that's what happened here. And it didn't damage their, at least didn't think any less well of Longstreet after this. It's really interesting. He was disappointed with him at Gettysburg, but it didn't change. He didn't write Longstreet off. Still relied on Longstreet later in the war. When Longstreet got wounded in the wilderness, he got shot in the neck on May the 6th, 1864. And when Lee found out about that, there was a staff officer who was right there and was watching, and he wrote the account. He said that Lee just was despairing when he found out that Longstreet had been shot. I mean, it really affected him. Not just because he liked him, which he did, but also because he knew he was by far the best subordinate that he had. Gettysburg didn't ruin that. Graham, did you have your hand up?
This whole incident as well sort of struck me as another moment of failure for Lee, where recognizing that Longwood was vehemently opposed to this plan, and probably also knowing that he was going to drag his feet even more than usual. It seems to me that the potential for him to undermine the next set of activities
on the third day you're talking about now, yeah,
should have led Lee to either change his plan and highly probably remove Longwood from that position where it could jeopardize the broader offensive. And so by not doing that, even a plan many of us would have opposed in the first case was even further undermined. And so that struck me then as like just a total moment of lack of leadership.
Okay, now we can't let that pass. Why? Longstreet said I shouldn't command this assault because not even half the men are mine.
I mean, there wasn't an alternative at that point.
Well, you just answered your question
But
then.
at the same then.
Why doesn't
but
AP
then-
Hill command the assault?
I,
Where the hell is he?
Yeah.
Lee doesn't even know where, go find
The lack
AP
of-
Hill.
The lack of an alternative should have been the impetus, in my view, for Lee to then reassess his plan, because lacking the critical components to execute it effectively made it a redundant, a pointless plan. And so regardless of whether it was the right plan, if he doesn't have the commitment of the senior leadership.
It wasn't the right plan.
Well,
But
regardless-
anyway, but never mind.
It
No,
could-
your
it was
point
even
is
less
taken.
likely to succeed without the right generals executing the plan at foot.
Mhm.
And so it just struck me as poorly executed from the get-go.
Okay, George Gordon Meade. There was much more support for Lee here than I thought there would be, actually. And I don't know whether that's just the power of Lee's image or, but it's interesting. Okay, Meade. George, our man, Jorge. He's in a very tough position. His first big decision is after midnight. I put July 1st. It actually isn't July 1st. He doesn't get to the battlefield till about midnight. And what's the first thing he has to decide? Brandon, you're shaking. What is it?
Should he stay or?
Yes. Are we going to fight here? Or are we going to fight somewhere else? What does he learn when he gets there? What does he know has happened that day?
Reynolds is dead.
John Reynolds is dead. That's really bad news. Your senior corps commander's dead.
Cemetery Hill is the best spot in the battlefield, isn't it?
Who's telling him that? Who's his key man on the field? Hancock. Winfield Scott Hancock, who is probably the most aggressive of all the corps commanders in the Army of the Potomac. Hancock says, yes, we can. This is really a good position. Bring everybody up and we can defend this position.
He also knows that the fight that day went badly.
Really badly. Yes, he knew Reynolds is dead. He also knows fairly well that half of Reynolds' whole corps is casualties. Half of Howard's whole 11th Corps, casualties. This is a big, big defeat on July 1st. And what the Army of the Potomac often would have done after a day like this is what? It would have retreated. So Meade, this is a key decision on Meade's part. Not to do what George McClellan probably would. If George McClellan retreated after a victory at Malvern Hill, here is a defeat. So I think Meade should get points for this. I mean, he listens to the men who were on the scene, and he really respects Hancock. But Howard tells him the same thing, that this can be defended. This ground can be defended. And he makes that decision pretty much by himself. I mean, he listens to people, but then he makes the decision. July 2nd, so he decides to stay. What were his, let me come back a half step. What are his options that night at 12:30 on the morning of July 2nd? What are his realistic options as commander of the Army of the Potomac? He can just lay them out. I mean, we've already said one, he can stay and defend that ground. What are the other ones?
You can back off.
He can retreat. He's thought about the Pipe Creek line.
He could set up for an offensive.
He can attack. He can attack. What's your sense of which of those he gave serious thought to? For him, there weren't really three options. For him, there were two options. Defend this ground or retreat and defend ground somewhere else, which I just bring us back. It's been a bad, bad day, yes, but this gets, I think, to this cultural difference between these two armies. I think that if Lee had been in Meade's position, he would have thought of three options, not just two. But Meade only thought of two, and I think that shows the degree to which he is a McClellanite in some ways. He's not thinking aggressively, he's thinking of holding on rather than really dealing a blow to the rebels. So he decides to hold on, and the troops pour up that night. And the fight, we're not going to talk again a lot about the fighting on the 2nd, but he does a good job on the 2nd. He moves troops back and forth. We've talked about this. Makes use of the interior lines, and in the end, his army holds on everywhere. So that night, what does George Gordon Meade do that night of July 2nd after this very, very heavy fighting?
He calls the Council of War with all of
He does. He calls a council of war, and almost all his top subordinates are there. And what do?
They talk about whether or not they want to retreat, stand their ground, or, well, those were pretty much their two.
Somebody mentions the A word, I think. Someone says attack at some point, but that's not going to happen. So it's really, do we hold our ground again, or do we retreat?
But interestingly, one of the essays showed that he had already, sent his correspondence to the general in
Yes.
command, back in Washington, that he was going to stay.
Yes.
And really, this Council of War was, he hadn't met all of his corps commanders face to face since assuming command of the entire Army of the Potomac. So it was really just to touch base and to talk with them. And
He had already made his decision, which often gets overlooked. But I've often wondered, too, what would have happened if 8 of the guys that night had said, retreat. Then I wonder what George Meade would have done. I'm not sure that Meade had been in charge long enough to say, okay, the vote is 2 in favor of staying and 8 against, we're going to stay. I'm not sure he was there yet. But he had already decided to stay, and the vote was to stay. The vote was to stay. But does that seem a reasonable way to go about making this decision on the part of somebody who was that new to command?
I think it makes sense because of that reason. I think just a few days ago, he was a peer.
He was one of them, yeah.
And so if he would have come in and imposed and said, we are going to stay, that may not have been as well accepted as, oh, look, we all came up with this idea together.
I'm going to agree with all of you. Instead of I've already decided, and this is what we're going to do.
If you have a good enough sense that they are not going to say you should retreat.
Right. Jeff?
You look at the opposite of what happened when you say, hey, we're going to do this, and go do it with Longstreet. That didn't work out. So.
Didn't work out, but you're not comparing apples and oranges there. You're kind of comparing artichokes and wing nuts. I mean, those are two very different situations in which you're making. So,
that's fair.
Yeah, but that's okay.
Getting buy-in is good.
So they're going to stay, and they stay. Now comes the heart of talking about George Gordon Meade at Gettysburg, and that is that one. You've just watched the Pickett-Pettigrew assault come toward you and then go away from you. And you see 3 shattered Confederate divisions in front of you. You know there are only 9 in Lee's whole army. You know that Lee has suffered heavy casualties on the other 2 days as well. And there you sit. What's the condition of your army at that point? Do you have any men who haven't fought yet? You're George Meade.
The biggest corps, the 6th Corps.
Oh yes, that's true. It's Sedgwick's corps hasn't fought yet, basically. I think they suffer a few hundred casualties in the whole battle. Talk about the decision not to follow up the repulse of Lee's assault.
I mean, it struck me as something that someone would do who is new, because not just from a tactical lack of knowledge, but also here he is, he's just improbably won this battle and can immediately go back to Lincoln and say, what a great decision you made. I have instant credibility in Washington, and why push it? Why risk that victory when you've secured your future and plenty of capital to go forward with? Not from a tactical military perspective, it's probably a bad decision, but I can see from his position as the leader of the army why.
That's a very reasonable position to take. What are some other reactions to this? Kyle?
One of my thoughts was just that they've done a great job in defending their position, but they haven't really shown any ability throughout the war to actually win and open field of battle. So I think attacking actually poses a lot bigger risk than a lot of people give credit to for, in that you actually have to come down in your strong position and show that you're as strong as the infantryman himself.
Boy, you're not giving the federal infantry much credit there, Kyle, I have to
I
say.
don't think they necessarily have it in them.
Marcus?
But isn't that more logical? If you're in a better terrain, to stay in the better terrain to fight on the better
So
terrain?
why risk it? Just stay here.
Isn't that? Unless somebody with military experience and strategy can, show something different, but that's the logical thing to do, isn't it?
There's a groundswell of meatism in the room, I can tell.
Almost 2 years and over 100,000 people died after this battle, well over 100,000. You could have potentially ended the war right here. If you attacked, even if you went 1 for 1, man for man, you still outnumber Lee's armies by so much. If you attack, defeat the Army of Northern Virginia, it's a cakewalk march into Richmond. The war's over in 2 months.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Abraham Lincoln, you are channeling Abraham Lincoln there. That's exactly his attitude. Congratulations for the victory. It's the biggest disappointment of the war for me, what you have failed to do. I'm very happy with what you did. I'm really upset with what you didn't do. Graham?
So in direct opposition to my previous point, I think in many ways he was unencumbered by previous losses, so probably should have pushed it. And so my prior point wasn't what I thought, but I could see why he did.
Are you thinking of running for office? You have potential. I think you have a future.
Not yet. So I think from that point of view, he had nothing to lose. I mean, people wouldn't have accused him of doing the wrong thing because they hadn't shown him.
Here's another thing. Let's rewind to Chancellorsville. Who was among the most unhappy Union Corps commanders at Chancellorsville? George Gordon Meade, because Hooker hadn't given the Army a chance to really fight. I mean, it's really interesting. And part of it is, of course, he wasn't ultimately in charge at Chancellorsville. So it's easy to say that. Harder to say that when you're the Army commander. This is a wonderful example of how when you move up in the chain of command, the stakes go up exponentially. You can fail as a Corps commander and it might not be catastrophic. If you fail as an Army commander, it could be catastrophic. And so it changes the way that a lot of people look at things. I think it's certainly, just compare Meade at Chancellorsville and Meade at Gettysburg. You have two different buckaroos in terms of how they want to put all the men in. Doesn't put all the men in at Gettysburg. There was a hand up over here somewhere. I caught it out of the corner of my eye.
I mean, to a degree, you just have like a situation where a dog has finally caught a car, like it's been chasing cars and finally caught one, and now it knows no idea what to do with it now that it's...
It's a really big dog, though, and a really small car.
I know, but they missed one, and they don't know, I mean, in their defense,
Right.
I mean, they have an untouched core, but, I mean, they've also suffered heavy casualties.
Oh, no,
They're already
heavy.
in disarray.
22,000. Yeah.
So, I think it's now... the fact that it's like 2 weeks later and Lee's still on the side of the Potomac and they don't go
Well, let's just slide on to category E
as
here.
days pass and become less sympathetic, but...
So he doesn't counterattack on July 3rd. Lee heads toward the Potomac River and golly, what does he find? The river's up. He can't get back across it. And so now the days start to tick by, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, the 8th, the 9th, the 10th. I can count very high, but I'll stop. All these days go by. And there's no battle. There's no real push. And there are lots of reasons. He has lots of reasons. All these casualties, problems of supply, problems of communication. You can list, we could write them all on the board, but of course we could list Lee's problems at that point, and the list would be longer. The list would be longer. And so now what do we do with George Gordon Meade? What about after the battle? And allowing Lee to remain intact until finally the river goes down. And just as the Army of the Potomac is getting ready to advance, they find out the Army of Northern Virginia is gone. They've gotten back across the river. What are we going to do with our man George now? There's a leitmotif in this, and I subscribe to this. You've got to cut him some slack because he's still brand new in command. He's been in the biggest battle of the war. He's got huge casualties. He's driven the rebels out of Pennsylvania. Check, check, check. So are those enough checks for us to say it's enough? That's enough. Give him a gold star, or at least an almost gold star, and just wait till the next battle. Or did he really miss an opportunity here? Does it matter that he really missed an opportunity here? Well, the answer to that, of course, is yes. It did matter. But how harsh was Lincoln too hard on him?
No, I think at this point you can be more critical of him and say that he should have pushed it a bit and actually started another battle there. But I think to your question is like, has he checked off enough and has he missed the opportunity? He only missed the opportunity if he had won that. If he goes there and loses, then I think that we have a much harsher view of him. And that's probably what was going through his head, is that...
So why risk it?
Why risk it? I don't think it was the right decision, but I think that's what he decided.
Yes, it is what he decided. Graham?
We know that the only way that the Union is going to win the war is defeating South militarily.
We know that, of course, don't we? We know that Appomattox is just down the road. Graham, stop that this instant.
No. What I mean is, from their strategic point of view, they knew that the way they ended the war was by winning militarily.
Yes.
And so, how many of these opportunities were going to present themselves where you had the South on the ropes and you could go and nail them to the wall? And it just wasn't going to happen very often. And so,
I mean, what is Lee encumbered with as he's trying to get out of the United States?
I mean, at this point, he has his back's against a river, and they don't even have any. Like, he should know the ground better too at that point, and know that there's really no defensible position. It seemed like for.
But one thing Lee has is thousands of wounded soldiers that he's carrying along with him. Meade does not have those. Meade will advance without having to look after thousands of wounded. Lee is carrying thousands of his wounded away with him. I mean, it's a real logistical nightmare to extricate a badly defeated army from enemy territory, especially if you do it under pressure. We've gone 2 minutes over. We can do a little more with Meade when we get together next time, if you like, and we'll get to Emily's hero, James Longstreet, in great detail next time. See you on December, whatever it is, 4th, 3rd, whatever.